The whisper of ghost soldiers. The alien queen stood on the balcony of her grand palace, staring out over the smoldering remains of a once thriving city. Her empire was vast, spanning countless star systems. She had conquered every planet with ease, crushing resistance under her massive fleets. To her, no force could stand against the might of her kind. Victory was a certainty. Her advisors, a council of the most cunning and ruthless beings in the galaxy, gathered behind her. They were whispering, arguing in hushed tones. Their usual confidence seemed shaken. The queen turned, her golden eyes narrowing. "Speak," she commanded, her voice sharp and cold. One of the advisors, a tall figure with skin like liquid metal, stepped forward. He bowed deeply before speaking. "Your Majesty, the scouts have returned from the outer colonies. They bring unsettling reports." The queen raised an eyebrow. "Unsettling? Explain." The advisor hesitated, glancing nervously at his companions. Finally, he said, "The colonies are whispering of a new threat. They claim humans." "Humans?" The queen interrupted with a scoff. "Fairy tales for children. Legends told to frighten the weak. Humans are a myth, nothing more." "Perhaps, Your Majesty," the advisor said cautiously. But the whispers grow louder. Survivors from the last campaign speak of shadowy warriors who strike without warning and vanish without a trace. They leave no survivors, only destruction. The queen's expression hardened. "Ghost stories will not frighten me. My empire was built on strength and fear. No phantom warriors can stand against us." Yet, even as she dismissed the idea, a seed of doubt took root. For weeks now, strange events had been reported. Entire garrisons had gone silent. Supplies vanished. Battleships were found adrift, their crews missing. And now the outer colony, one of her strongest strongholds, had gone dark. "Send a detachment to the colony," she ordered. "Find out what has happened. Bring me answers, not rumors." Far away, on the edge of the Queen's empire, the colony of Arrakis lay shrouded in silence. It had once been a bustling hub of trade and military strength, its skies filled with sleek alien ships. Now there was nothing but an eerie stillness. The detachment arrived, their ships slicing through the heavy atmosphere. The elite soldiers disembarked, weapons at the ready. They moved cautiously, scanning the empty streets. Buildings stood intact, yet there were no signs of life. It was as if the entire population had simply vanished. The squad leader, a grizzled veteran with glowing armor, raised a hand. "Spread out. Search every corner. I want answers." The soldiers fanned out, their boots crunching against the cracked pavement. Inside the colony's command center, they found the control room intact. Terminals blinked with life, but there were no operators. Dust floated lazily in the air. "Play back the last transmission," the squad leader ordered. A technician tapped at the controls, and a room filled with static. Then, a distorted voice broke through. "They're here. We can't stop them. They see everything, everywhere. Run." The message cut off abruptly. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. "What does that mean?" one of them muttered. The squad leader shook his head. "Doesn't matter. We need to report this tow." A sudden noise cut him off. A faint whisper, like a breeze moving through the room. The soldiers froze, weapons raised. "Did you hear that?" one asked, his voice tense. Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered. Shadows danced on the walls, moving in unnatural patterns. One of the soldiers swore under his breath. "Stay sharp," the squad leader barked. "No one moves alone." But it was too late. A soldier near the back let out a strangled cry and disappeared into the darkness. His weapon clattered to the ground. "Price," another called out, panic creeping into his voice. "Where did he?" A low, menacing hum filled the air, growing louder. The squad leader's visor picked up faint movements, too fast to track. Something was out there, watching them. "Fall back," he ordered. "Regroup at the ship." The soldiers retreated, their movements frantic. Yet, one by one, they vanished into the shadows. The whispers grew louder, surrounding the survivors. Panic set in as they realized they were being hunted. By the time the squad leader reached the ship, he was alone. Blood pounded in his ears as he sealed the hatch. The ship's engines roared to life, and it shot into the sky. In the Queen's palace, the council gathered again. The lone survivor of the detachment stood before them, trembling. His armor was scorched, his face pale. "Your Majesty," he rasped, "they're real. The humans, they're real." The Queen stared at him, her disbelief wavering. "What did you see?" The soldier's voice shook as he replied, "They move like ghosts. You can't see them until it's too late. We didn't stand a chance." The Queen clenched her fists, her golden eyes burning with fury. "Humans or not, no one defies my rule. I will crush these shadows, just as I have crushed all who stood against me." But deep down, for the first time in her reign, she felt a flicker of fear. The shadows were coming, and they brought with them the whispers of an unstoppable force. Footsteps in the void. The Queen's elite strike vessel drifted silently above the colony of Arrakis. From orbit, the city looked perfectly intact, as if life still bustled below. But every sensor sweep returned the same result. No life signs. Inside the dropship, Commander Varric checked his team's gear. The air was thick with tension. These were the Queen's best soldiers, yet none of them spoke. They'd all heard the rumors, the whispers. "All right, listen up," Varric said, snapping his helmet into place. "This is a reconnaissance mission. Nothing more. We go in, we scan the colony, and we report back. Simple." One of the younger soldiers shifted nervously. "And if we find them?" Varric's gaze hardened. "There's no them. Humans are just." Before he could finish, the dropship jolted violently. Lights flickered, and for a moment, everything was dark. "Pilot," Varric barked. The pilot's voice crackled through the comms, confused. "We just drifted off course. But nothing's wrong. Systems check out fine." Varric frowned but dismissed it. "Stay sharp. We're going in." The colony streets were deserted as the team advanced. Buildings stood untouched. Food left to rot in market stalls. There was no sign of struggle. "This place is too clean," one soldier muttered. "Where are the bodies?" Varric scanned the area. "Keep moving." As they approached the central command center, a faint sound echoed down the empty streets, the soft creak of footsteps. The soldiers froze. "Who's there?" Varric called, raising his weapon. "Nothing." "Could be automated systems restarting," the soldier suggested. Varric didn't answer. He'd heard footsteps before. This wasn't mechanical. Inside the command center, dust hung in the air. The terminals were still active. The last log flickered across the screen. Time-stamped from the night the colony went silent. Varric played the file. A grainy image appeared, the colony's governor, pale and frantic. He leaned close to the camera, whispering, "We locked the doors. It doesn't matter. They're already inside. They don't come from the sky. They're just here, watching, listening." The governor's eyes darted behind him. Then the feed cut out. "That's impossible," one soldier whispered. "There are no breaches in the perimeter." Varric clenched his jaw. "Someone download the logs. We're leaving." But as one of the soldiers stepped toward the terminal, he paused. "Commander, something's wrong with the floor." Varric glanced down. The floor beneath their feet was smooth metal, but scattered across it were faint, human-sized footprints. They weren't alien. They weren't mechanical. They led directly to where the soldiers stood. A cold chill swept through the room. "Contact. Rear exit," someone shouted. The team spun, weapons aimed, but there was no target. Only shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. Varric's visor flared with movement sensors. But the readings made no sense. The motion wasn't coming from any direction. It was coming from above. Move. Now. They ran, but the footsteps followed, echoing too close. One by one, the soldiers began to falter, staggering and vanishing into the black corners of the colony. No screams. No gunfire. Just silence as the shadows swallowed them whole. By the time Varric stumbled back into the dropship, his heart pounded against his ribs. The ship's clock hadn't moved. It was as if he had never left. As the engines roared to life, Varric caught a glimpse of the colony below. The streets were filled with figures, standing motionless, watching. But as the ship lifted off, the figures blurred and disappeared. "Pilot," Varric whispered, his voice barely steady, "get us out of here. Now." In the Queen's war chamber, Varric knelt, trembling before her throne. She stared down at him. "You returned alone." Varric swallowed hard. "Your Majesty, they're already inside your empire. You just can't see them yet." The Queen's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Varric lifted his head slowly, and for the first time in her reign, the Queen saw fear in the eyes of one of her finest warriors. "The humans." The Queen's gambit. The Queen stood alone in her war chamber, gazing at the holographic projection of her empire. Planets spun lazily around their stars, each marked by symbols of conquest. Yet, on the outer edges of the map, a dark void had begun to spread, erasing colonies without explanation. At her feet, Commander Varric knelt, head bowed. His armor was scared, his breathing ragged. "Rise," she commanded. Varric lifted his gaze, but his eyes were not the same. The fearless commander who had crushed rebellions now looked like a man who had glimpsed something beyond comprehension. "You say they're inside my empire," the Queen said, circling him slowly. "But you brought me no proof. No bodies. No prisoners. Why should I believe in ghosts?" Varric's hands tightened into fists. "Because they don't fight like us. They don't fight for land or power. They fight for the kill, and they enjoy it." The Queen's gaze hardened. "Enjoy it? They could have wiped us out instantly," Varric whispered. "But they didn't. They waited. They watched. They wanted to see how long we'd last." A faint flicker crossed the Queen's expression. Curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper. "Let them watch, then," she said coldly. "I will draw them out." 2 weeks later, the trap is set. The Queen's fleets hung in formation over the planet Varric Prime, one of the last remaining colonies along the Empire's border. Thousands of warships hovered in low orbit, weapons primed and defenses at full capacity. She had personally chosen Varric Prime, a shining jewel of alien architecture, as bait. If the humans truly existed, they would come for it. The Queen's War Council stood beside her, watching the void beyond the system. Hours passed in silence. "They won't show," one of her generals finally muttered. "They're already here," Varric said softly. The Queen glanced at him but said nothing. Suddenly, the lights in the war chamber flickered. A ripple swept through the fleet outside. Sensors flared as a single human ship appeared at the edge of the system. It was small, far too small to pose a threat. The Queen frowned. "One ship. They're mocking us," Varric said, teeth clenched. "Good," the Queen replied. "Destroy it." The command was given. Massive plasma cannons charged across the fleet, locking onto the lone vessel. But before the first shot was fired, the human ship vanished. No explosions, no energy readings. It simply ceased to exist. Moments later, alarms blared across the flagship. "Intruder detected." The war chamber's doors split open, and a figure stepped inside as if he had been invited. A human. He wore no armor, no weapon in sight. His clothing was dark and simple, like a shadow walking in the form of a man. Varric's hand went to his weapon, but the Queen raised a hand to stop him. "Who are you?" she asked. The human's eyes glinted with something unsettling. Amusement. "I thought you'd be taller," he said casually, glancing around the chamber. But I suppose myths always exaggerate. The Queen's lips curled in disdain. You're alone. You expect to challenge an empire by yourself. The human smiled faintly. I'm not alone. I never was. As he spoke, the chamber's walls shifted, faint outlines appearing along the edges. Dozens of human figures stepped from the shadows, as if they had been there all along. The War Council stumbled back in shock, but the Queen didn't move. They didn't breach the ship, Varric stammered. They were already here. The Queen met the human's gaze, her mind racing. How long had they been watching? What do you want? She demanded. The human tilted his head. You took one of our colonies, a quiet little place on the edge of nowhere. We let it go, at first, but then you came back. The Queen narrowed her eyes. We take what is ours. The human's smile faded. So do we. Outside, the sky above Varric Prime darkened. The Queen's war fleet stood at the ready, but something had changed. Ship after ship began to blink off sensors, one by one. Her generals panicked, shouting orders. But no one could explain what was happening. On the Queen's personal view screen, a message appeared. 3 simple words. We are here. She turned back to the human standing in her chamber. For the first time, the Queen wondered if her empire had already fallen. The first strike. The Queen stood in silence aboard her flagship, staring at the empty void beyond Varric Prime. Her fleet had not moved. Her soldiers had not fired a shot. Yet the human ship, the one they had all seen, was gone. No explosion, no wreckage, just gone. In the war chamber, her generals whispered nervously. Commander Varric watched them all, his hand hovering near his weapon. They're playing with us, he said. The Queen's gaze didn't shift. Let them play. Her confidence was unshaken. Outwardly, at least. Yet deep down, a thought lingered like a shadow. What if Varric was right? Hours later, Varric Prime. Aboard the orbital defense station, High Warden Kravik monitored the fleet. The Queen's ships were like shimmering blades hanging in the night sky. But something felt off. The stars beyond the planet didn't look right. Kravik squinted at his display. The stars flickered unnaturally, shifting out of place. It wasn't a visual glitch. They were being blocked. Activate long-range scans, he ordered. As the scans pulsed outward, a shape emerged in the void. A massive black silhouette, far larger than anything Kravik had ever seen, hung just outside the range of their sensors. It had been there the entire time, perfectly still. Before Kravik could process what he was looking at, his display glitched and shut off. All systems down, a technician cried. Kravik's blood ran cold. We're blind. The Queen's flagship, minutes later. Reports flooded in from the outer perimeter. Ships were going dark. No explosions, no distress calls, just silence. Humans can't do this, one general growled. They don't have this kind of power. Maybe not power, Varric said grimly, but precision. That's different. The Queen turned toward the viewing window. They've made a mistake, she said coldly. How so? Varric asked. They've revealed themselves. Varric Prime. Surface. A squad of alien ground forces patrolled the outer city, weapons humming softly in the night. The streets were quiet, too quiet. Even the wind had stopped. Suddenly, a single human figure stepped out from the shadows. He wore a hood, his face obscured by a metallic mask. In his hands, he held no weapon. The lead alien barked an order, and plasma rifles snapped into place. Kneel, human. The figure didn't move. The aliens advanced cautiously. This is your last warning. The human slowly raised his hand and pointed toward the sky. The soldiers hesitated. One glanced upward, and his eyes widened in horror. Above them, their warships were falling. Silent, burning husks, crashing toward the planet like meteors. Panic erupted. The soldiers fired, but by the time their weapons ignited, the human was gone. War chamber. The Queen's eyes narrowed as reports flooded in. Ground forces were in chaos. Entire battalions had gone missing without a trace. She clenched her fists, voice steady. "Tell me, Varric, do humans wield magic now?" Varric shook his head. "It's not magic. They're using technology we can't understand. They fight wars like predators. They'd break the mind first, then the body." The Queen's gaze drifted back to the holographic map of her empire. System after system flickered out. "They're dismantling us." "Yes," Varric replied, "piece by piece." Outside Varric Prime. As the Queen's remaining fleet scrambled to retreat, a new signal broke through the comms. A direct transmission. It wasn't in alien code. It wasn't encrypted. It was a human voice. Calm. Cold. "You had your chance. Now we take ours." The transmission ended, but not before leaving behind a signature, one the Queen recognized from ancient texts. A name. Earth. For the first time in her reign, the Queen felt something foreign take hold of her heart. Fear. The fall of the Queen's Armada. The Queen's flagship drifted silently above Varric Prime, surrounded by the wreckage of her once great fleet. Her war council sat in stunned silence, their faces pale. The Grand Armada, thousands of ships strong, had been reduced to smoldering debris within hours, and no one had seen the enemy fire a single shot. The Queen's golden eyes scanned the holographic map. Entire sectors flickered and faded, like embers dying out one by one. This is impossible," one of the generals whispered. "They didn't engage. They didn't even appear on our sensors." "They didn't need to," Varric said coldly. "They were already inside the fleet." The Queen's gaze didn't shift. "Explain." Varric stepped forward, his voice steady but grim. "I've seen the humans do this before. They don't fight conventionally. They infiltrate. They disrupt. By the time you realize they're there, you've already lost." One of the younger strategists shook his head. "Even if they infiltrated a few ships, how could they destroy the entire armada without us detecting them?" Varric glanced at the Queen. "They didn't destroy the armada. They erased it." The room fell silent. Aboard the surface of Varric Prime, the skies above the capital were scared with falling debris. Burning starships rained down in streaks of light, crashing into the forests and oceans below. From her war chamber, the Queen watched the devastation unfold. Civilians fled into underground shelters, but no human soldiers ever appeared. There were no demands, no broadcasts, no invasions, only silence. The Queen's lips tightened. "Why don't they attack?" Varric stood beside her, watching the same scene. "Because they already have." Orbit of Varric Prime, minutes earlier. Admiral Telos of the remaining outer fleet stood on the bridge of his cruiser, sweat pooling beneath his armor. He was surrounded by the skeleton crew that survived the first wave. "Sir, we've lost contact with the 7th Division," one officer stammered. Telos gritted his teeth. "Patch me through to the Queen's flagship." As the officer opened the channel, static hissed across the comms. Then came a voice. "You shouldn't have come here." The entire bridge froze. "That wasn't the Queen," the officer whispered. Telos' heart pounded. "Identify that transmission." I can't," the officer said, panic rising. "It's coming from inside the ship." Before Telos could react, the lights dimmed. A shadow moved across the far end of the bridge. But there was no one there. One by one, the officers around him slumped forward, eyes wide open, but lifeless. Telos staggered back, but his legs gave out beneath him. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the faint outline of a human figure standing at the bridge controls. "We were here the whole time." War chamber. The Queen's patience waned. "Varric, enough riddles. Where are they?" Varric's eyes darkened. "Right here, watching us." At that moment, the lights flickered. A deep, low hum resonated through the chamber walls. The Queen's War Council gripped their weapons, scanning the corners of the room. "Security breach," a guard shouted. "Multiple signatures detected." Before he could finish, his armor cracked open at the chest, and he collapsed. From the shadows, humans emerged. The Queen's final stand. The Queen's soldiers opened fire instantly, plasma rounds tearing through the air, but the humans moved like phantoms, weaving between each shot. One by one, the War Council fell, until only the Queen and Varric remained. The lead human stepped forward, his weapon holstered. He looked around the chamber with mild curiosity. "You're resilient," the human said, meeting the Queen's gaze. "I can see why your empire lasted this long." The Queen narrowed her eyes. "You think this is over?" The human smiled faintly. "It was over before it began." She clenched her fists, taking a step forward. "And what happens now? You destroy us, conquer our worlds." The human's expression hardened. "No." The Queen hesitated. "Then what do you want?" The human's eyes burned with something ancient. Not hatred, but purpose. "To remind you that you're not alone in this galaxy. You never were." The Queen's gaze faltered. For the first time, she felt the weight of true fear. As the human turned to leave, he glanced over his shoulder. "Fairy tales don't stay myths forever." With that, they vanished, leaving the Queen standing alone in the ruins of her empire. Desperation. The Queen stood at the window of her war chamber, watching her empire crumble in silence. The skies above Varric Prime were clear now, but not because the battle had ended. There had never been a battle. The humans didn't march through the streets or land armies on her worlds. They didn't need to. The fear alone was enough. Entire colonies were abandoning their posts. Governors fled. Armadas vanished without trace or fight. The Queen's empire, once unshakable, was unraveling by its own hand. The Queen turned toward her remaining council. What few members hadn't disappeared into the shadows. "Recall the fleets," she ordered. "Every ship, every soldier. Bring them home." Varric, standing by her side, spoke cautiously. "With respect, Your Majesty." "What fleets?" Her golden eyes snapped to him, sharp and burning with rage. Varric met her gaze but didn't look away. "They're gone. Elsewhere, aboard the Outer Rim listening post." A faint hum echoed through the station as a lone technician monitored the Queen's final stronghold. The post overlooked the last bastion of the Empire, the heart of the Dominion where the Queen's palace resided. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. The technician stretched, stifling a yawn, until he saw something on the scanner. A single blip. A small ship, human in design. "Commander," he whispered into his comm, panic rising. The line hissed. There was no response. The technician's breath quickened. He tried again, fingers trembling over the controls. "Sir, we have movement near the home system." Before he could finish, the lights around him dimmed. A second blip appeared. Then 3. Then 20. The humans weren't coming. They were already here. "War chamber, the Queen's palace." "Your Majesty." A voice crackled over the palace intercom. Unidentified signatures are appearing across the core system. The Queen's claws tapped against the stone table as she processed the words. "How many?" The voice hesitated. "All of them." The chamber fell into a heavy silence. The Queen's cold expression didn't falter, but Varric saw it, the flicker of doubt in her eyes. "What are your orders, Majesty?" Varric asked. The Queen turned slowly toward the viewing window, gazing at the stars. "They want fear," she said softly. "But fear will not stop me." Her voice rose, sharp and commanding. "Prepare the palace defenses. Activate planetary shields. I want every weapon trained on the skies." Varric hesitated. "Your Majesty, if they're already inside the system, defenses may not." The Queen's gaze snapped to him. "Then we bury them." The descent. As her orders echoed through the palace, the Queen retreated to the deepest level of her fortress, a sprawling vault of black stone and silver walls. This was the final chamber, where no alien invader had ever set foot. Varric followed closely behind, unease carved into his face. "The humans don't fight for land or wealth," he said as they walked. "They don't need to conquer us." The Queen didn't look at him. "They want something else," he continued. Finally, the Queen stopped at the entrance to the vault. She placed a hand on the ancient door, watching as symbols ignited under her touch. "They want to end us," she replied coldly. "Completely." The vault creaked open, revealing a weapon, ancient and forbidden. A device capable of turning stars to dust. Varric's breath caught in his throat. "You can't mean to." "I will burn this system to ash before I surrender it to shadows," the Queen said, her eyes glowing fiercely. Varric stepped forward, voice low and urgent. "Majesty, if you do this, there will be nothing left. No empire, no people, only ruin." The Queen's gaze didn't waver. "Then the humans will have nothing too." The Vault of Stars. As the Queen's hand hovered over the weapon's controls, the air around them shifted. The room darkened. "I wouldn't do that," a voice whispered from the shadows. The Queen froze. Slowly, she turned. A human stood behind her. He was unarmed, unarmored, his face calm and expressionless. Varric's hand went to his weapon, but the Queen raised her hand to stop him. "You've come far," she said, masking the unease in her voice, "to stand before me." The human smiled faintly. "We've been standing here for a long time." Varric's eyes darted nervously to the edges of the room. Other humans were emerging from the shadows, silent, watching. "How did you breach the vault?" the Queen demanded. The human stepped forward. "You left the door open." Her eyes narrowed. "I left nothing open." The human's gaze met hers, steady and piercing. "You never saw the door." Final warning. The Queen stood her ground, but for the first time, she felt the weight of uncertainty. "What do you want?" she asked. The human's voice was quiet, but the room felt heavier with every word. "To remind you." "Of what?" The human's eyes burned. "That monsters aren't the only things that live in the dark." Before the Queen could respond, the human stepped back, fading into the shadows once more. The vault was empty. But the Queen knew the truth now. The humans hadn't come to destroy her empire. They had come to end the idea that it could ever rise again. The Queen's reckoning. The Queen stood alone in the ruins of her war chamber. Smoke drifted lazily through the cracks in the walls, and the once pristine banners of her empire hung in tatters. The palace around her, once the heart of a vast dominion, was silent. Her empire had not fallen in fire and war. It had faded, one breath at a time. The humans had never come in force. No grand battles, no fleets storming the skies. They had simply appeared. And now, her palace was empty. Varric was gone. The War Council was gone. The only sound that remained was the soft click of footsteps approaching from behind. The throne room. The Queen ascended the final steps to her throne, gripping the stone armrests as she seated herself. Her golden armor reflected the faint glow of the stars outside. She wouldn't run. This was her empire. If the humans wanted her throne, they would have to take it from her cold, dead hands. "Are you waiting for something?" a voice called from the shadows. The Queen's eyes narrowed. She didn't turn. "You've taken everything else. Why not finish it?" From the far side of the chamber, the human stepped forward. He moved casually, as if the weight of the galaxy didn't rest on his shoulders. His clothing was simple, no weapons in sight. But the Queen knew better. "We were taught that humans were nothing but myths," she said coldly, her voice echoing in the empty chamber. "Fairy tales for children. I should have listened more carefully." The human smiled faintly. "Fairy tales exist for a reason." He stopped a few paces from the base of the throne. The distance between them felt wider than the stars. "And what lesson do you think this tale was supposed to teach you?" the human asked softly. The Queen met his gaze, her golden eyes burning fiercely. "That everything can burn," she said. The human chuckled. You're not wrong. The final question. The queen leaned forward slightly, her claws tapping against the stone. Why didn't you destroy us? She asked. You could have. You still can. The human's expression softened, but there was no kindness behind his eyes. We didn't need to. The queen frowned. You expect me to believe this was mercy? The human's gaze darkened. Not mercy. Balance. The queen's hands tightened around the armrests. Balance, she repeated, her voice laced with disdain. You dismantled an empire that took centuries to build. There is no balance in this. The human tilted his head slightly. Your empire was a fire. A bright, consuming fire that thought it could burn forever, he said. But all fires burn out eventually. We didn't snuff it out. We just waited for the wind to do the rest. The queen's heart pounded, but she refused to let it show. You waited, she repeated. The human nodded. The greatest weapon humans ever had, he said, stepping closer, was patience. The last stand. The queen rose from her throne slowly, standing to her full height. I won't kneel, she said. The human smiled again. We never asked you to. The queen's claws flexed at her sides. You think I will let this end in whispers. If I fall fighting. The human's gaze flickered with something almost like respect. I expected nothing less. For a moment, the chamber fell silent. The queen's hand moved toward the blade at her hip, but as her fingers brushed the hilt, she paused. Because behind the human, dozens of others stood. They hadn't made a sound. She hadn't felt their presence. And yet, they filled the room like ghosts returning to claim forgotten ground. The last words. The human at the front stepped closer until he stood just beneath her throne. You wanted to know why we didn't destroy you, he said, his voice soft but sharp as steel. The queen's grip on the blade loosened. Why? She whispered. The human's eyes met hers, cold and unrelenting. Because monsters don't deserve legends. The queen's heart slowed. In that moment, she realized the truth. Her empire wouldn't be remembered. The humans would leave nothing behind. Not ruins, not history. Just silence. As the stars outside the palace faded into the night, the queen finally understood. Fairy tales didn't end in war. They ended with forgotten kingdoms and ghosts no one could see.